Hell Hulk is the most powerful Hulk in Marvel Comics right now, and it's not even close, right? It's nuts. This guy is next level. But here's a crazy thing. All of this actually starts with Daken, the son of Wolverine. And what's going on here is he is joining a reworked version of an organization called Project Hellfire. Now, I know a lot of you guys who are familiar with the X-Men comics are like, Rob, Daken's dead. How is he back? The last time we saw him, he was literally torn apart by Wolverine, and the words happy birthday were spelled out using his body parts. Yes, you're correct. Sabretooth did that. It was pretty gruesome, but we'll explain what's going on here in a minute. The first thing that I want to do, though, is talk about what's actually happening here, because one of the first new people that Daken is introduced to as part of Project Hellfire is a guy named Severeth. Now, he's already aware of a couple of the different members who were there, including Dr. Spivey, the person who basically runs the program, or at least the head scientist in the program. But Severeth, as you can imagine, is sketchy at best. I mean, look at this dude, right? If ever there were a person in Marvel Comics who might as well have giant purple letters over their head that say, I am a villain, it's this guy. I mean, look at this dude. Nothing about this guy indicates that he may be a good guy in any meaningful way. The other cool thing here is that Daken is presented with basically his own Ghost Rider bike, which is pretty dope, and it looks pretty amazing. But one of the things that's going on and what's really taking place here is that for reasons that cannot be explained, there are instances, pockets of people in various locations who are just going absolutely haywire, who are going nuts and descending into madness and to chaos. The first instance of this is in a neighborhood outside of Atlanta, right? And we're told that it's so fresh, you can smell the paint and sawdust on this place. And initially, Daken doesn't fully understand what it is that's going on. He does have an infernal sense, which is almost like a Spider-Man spider sense, except that it allows him to detect basically evil that goes on around him. And it even allows him to see through the various disguises of beings to know whether or not they are actually evil. At least that seems to be the case. But all he's really told by Severeth is that when the police arrived, they found the doors and the windows all locked. The alarm was set. The neighbors called the cops when they heard screaming, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. And he asks, do you sense anything? And that's when Daken starts looking around with his infernal sense, and his first thought, I wish I didn't. And he says, but hell has left a stain on this place. He says the wife, the husband, the children, the dog, they killed each other with kitchen knives, shaving razors, a broken chair leg, teeth. It was all of them. They were all victims and they were all killers, even the fish. And that's where Severeth almost kind of admires the situation, right? It says a rage more powerful than love. Isn't it awe-inspiring? And it kind of creeps out Daken to a degree. He's like, look, I don't know what your problem is, man, but like this kind of a thing is not something to be awed or celebrated, right? We're literally witnessing a family where they massacred each other. It's to be pitied and it's to be despised, and whoever it was that caused this is to be hunted down and destroyed. And so what he ends up doing is going down into the basement. Why? Because in every horror movie, that's where the bad stuff comes from. And so once he gets down there, he manifests Bagra-ghul, right? Lets Bagra-ghul take over and he becomes the Hellverine. Now that name may sound familiar to you guys who are familiar with the Wolverine and Ghost Rider crossover. It should. And again, that kind of goes into the explanation of what's happening with Daken in the here and now. But he ends up tearing through the floor and then finds a finger. And what ends up happening is that when they get it back, there's this kind of indication that this finger sent people into a mindless rage, right? That is emitting a kind of radiation that drove people insane. More so than that, because Daken's kind of being reintroduced to all of this, what he's told by Spivey is he says, you can see why we need that infernal compass of yours. Because of your demonic composition, you too seem to be immune to its irradiating effect. I'll stay behind, but I will be watching. Because what ends up happening is that with Severeth being part demon and with Daken being infected by a demon, they're able to enter into this room where the Hell Hulk resides. And of course, as you can tell, it's missing its head, and it's essentially missing pieces. One of them, of course, being its finger along with a few other fingers. And so when this finger is reattached, one of the things that Severeth says is that with this Hell Hulk, The radiation it emits drives people into just this mindless rage. And he even says, Dr. Spivey had a pet cat named Archimedes. It snuck in here behind me. By the time I realized it, it was too late. The cat had been driven to chew off its own leg and claw out its own eyes. That's the kind of rage that we're talking about here. And so once the finger's attached, the Hellhulk clenches its fist. And what this seems to indicate is that it's quite literally coming alive. And so that's where Daken asks the question, why am I here? Right? Why do you guys even have me here in the first place? And all he's really told is that they've done analysis, at least soil analysis, on the finger that they unearthed, that is consistent with all of their other findings, that the burial directly precedes the emergence of the Hellverine, the demon now nested inside of Daken. Not only that, Dr. Spivey says Bagra-ghul built anatomical ciphers and monuments to Mephisto, all of them infused with hell magic. If the demon is responsible for the internment of the Hellhulk, then maybe you can help us understand the intentions behind it. After all, Daken is possessed by Bagra-ghul, so who better to be able to give them answers to why seemingly Hellhulk was torn to pieces and dropped off in these various locations by Bagra-ghul than the person who's infected by him. And so at that point, they get word of another kind of crazed situation going on out there on a ship somewhere. And so this leads to Daken coming along yet again, only to find that Hellhulk's head is down in the bottom of this ocean, just a radiating rage that's driving all the occupants to absolutely go insane. And so what ends up happening is that Townsend, one of the members of Project Hellfire, basically drops a containment unit designed to effectively block the radiation of Hellhulk and to allow everybody to start going back to a normal state. Specifically, this instance is taking place out in a lake, and all these individuals are being driven to a state of madness because Hellhulk's head is at the bottom of this lake. Not only that, once Daken and Townsend and all those guys arrive on the scene, Townsend tells Daken, I'm opening the hatch, dropping the containment unit and hoping for the best. If we do not complete this extraction in the next few minutes, people are going to die, and the lake water will run red. So it's really on him, because even Townsend says, I'm starting to feel it. It's like a heavy metal frequency in the air, or a poison slowly working through my blood. We're all losing control. The passengers have thrown themselves overboard. The ones that do not drown are coming for the Hellbruiser, right? This ship they're using to extract this head in the first place. But that's the thing that Daken starts to pick up on. Again, kind of being immune to this. He says, it's the Hellhulk that's creating the perfect storm. The pieces of him that we've uncovered so far give off an energy that sends people into a mindless rage. I seem to be immune to it, maybe because of the devil that's in me, but my infernal sense is lighting up like a forest fire. And he says, I don't know what I see in that burning moment, but it scares the hell out of me, because what he's effectively looking at here is a laboratory in hell, or at least that seems to be the case, which is kind of nuts, because of course, once he gets this thing contained, everybody immediately starts going back to a normal state. And in fact, they don't even really seem to know how it was they got there in the first place. But once the head's contained, then it's just a matter of getting it back to headquarters. Here's the crazy thing about this. In the midst of all of it, he says, something's missing. And I don't just mean pieces of Hellhulk that we're hunting down and puzzling together. It's the mystery of his larger story and how it fits together with mine. He says, for now, at my insistence, we're storing the head in a separate location. The containment unit is built from an alloy with metal mined out of hell itself, but I can still sense the rage coming off of it, like an angry voice heard through the walls of an apartment. The body of the Hellhulk gives off a low-level frequency that we're still trying to understand, but the head gives off a far stronger signal like a power cell. The brain, Dr. Spivey believes, is still active, and that's what I want. Its mind, its mission, and its memories to plug in to pain. And so what he does is he uses the Hellverine equivalent of what you and I might consider to be the penance stare, not in the sense that it inflicts pain, but in the sense that the infernal sense that he has allows him to basically see what's been going on with this thing. And in a lot of ways, the story of Hellhulk kind of mirrors the story of Wolverine. It was created through experimentation, and that's what we're told. Screams of rage and pain, hellfire and sulfur, scientific and surgical equipment, a furnace or reactor, a laboratory, Hell's own laboratory. Mephisto is there, Hellhulk is there, Bagra-ghul is there, and someone else. He can't quite put his finger on it, but someone is there. And so here's the insanity behind all this, and here's kind of the bigger picture of what's going on. And so as we established, Daken was killed at one point in time. Bagra-ghul was a demon created by Mephisto that was really kind of his own, I guess maybe ego run away with itself. But the idea behind Bagra-ghul is that he would travel to Earth and then basically start erecting these kind of monuments of art and death. Quite literally, killing virtually anybody he could find and creating these grotesque displays of art. Initially, Bagra-ghul had possessed a kid by the name of Brahm, and then Brahm started traveling around and killing mutants everywhere that he could find them. Of course, that coincided with the Fall of X storyline, the end of the Krakoan Age, all that kind of stuff. That drew the attention of both Wolverine as well as Ghost Rider. It drew the attention of Wolverine because mutants were being killed. It drew the attention of Ghost Rider because a demon was doing it. And so ultimately, Wolverine was basically brought into Project Hellfire and then bonded with the demon entity. Specifically, Bagra-ghul was taken from Brahm and bonded to Wolverine. The intention was to turn Wolverine into just this kind of super soldier with demonic powers. So effectively, Project Hellfire was a spin-off of Weapons Plus, right? The program that originally turned Wolverine into Wolverine. What ends up happening is that he basically turncoats, and then ultimately Project Hellfire was defeated in its original form. Of course, Wolverine also lost Bagra-ghul as well. Now, there will be an explanation for what happened to Bagra-ghul later on. We'll talk about that here in a second. But in essence, he came back. And when he came back, it was at the time when Daken had died. And so Bagra-ghul had quite literally restructured Daken, brought him back together, sewn him back together in one piece, and then possessed him. And so, as is normally the case, when an individual is possessed by a demon, specifically when the Ghost Rider mythos is being referenced, there's a period of amnesia when that individual doesn't really know who they are, they don't know their own history, they're just kind of running amok as an individual possessed by a demon. Over time, Daken started to seize control, and that's why at the very beginning of the Hellverine story with Daken himself, that instead of what you saw previously, where Bagra-ghul was just killing virtually any and everybody that it happened to come across, that Daken was following the traditional Ghost Rider mythos, only going after sinners, evildoers, people who were acting with nefarious intent. And so that kind of brings him to where he is now. But that's the crazy thing about all of this, is because one of the things that had happened in the first volume of this story, because this is technically volume 2, is that he was met by Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange, of course, was no longer operating as Sorcerer Supreme due to the events of Bloodhunt and the fact that Doctor Doom was the new Sorcerer Supreme. And so all Doctor Strange could really do was provide Daken with something called the Book of Lamentation, which would basically teach him various spells and incantations related to demonic mythology, kind of help him on his journey in trying to track down evildoers and so on and so forth. But because of that book, it's when he starts to realize something much bigger is happening with this whole Hellhulk situation. Because initially, Severith comes in and says, hey, the government's really excited about what we're doing. After all, we are kind of funded by the government, right? We're a branch off of the government's own individual projects. They're using phrases like dirty bomb and weapon of mass destruction, but the reality here is they want to see if we can bring Hellhulk under control and see if we can provide him as a weapon for the government to use. But that's when Daken says no, right? The answer is absolutely not. And he says, I've been studying the Book of Lamentation, a text Doctor Strange gave me. It's essentially a demonic codex for hellish ciphers and magic. And I've learned firsthand when it comes to hell, there's often strategy hidden beneath the terror and madness. And I found something. This is the pattern of chaos. And he says, we already know that the demon inside me, Bagra-ghul, had some role in all of this. These burials, I think they're a different sort of monument, one that was built the world over. But initially, eventually he just starts bleeding from his various orifices and then just collapses. And so following that, he just kind of wakes up, right, comes to in a graveyard, and he's effectively traveling around to kind of regain himself, recenter himself, right? That from his perspective, his father Wolverine would always get drunk, or at least try to get drunk in order to clear his head. For Daken, it's revisiting his past errors, because one of the ways in which he basically retakes control from Bagra-ghul is by feeling remorse, feeling guilt and shame for the various things he's done, which that kind of empathy drives demonic beings away. So it allows him to retake control. That's when Severus shows up here. And the crazy thing about this is that the two of them kind of start having this conversation where Severus approaches him as a colleague and a friend and says, look, here's the thing for you to understand, that yes, I am a person who has done nefarious things in the past, and I am ashamed of my demonic heritage, or at least my ties to the occult. And he says, but I will let you do something, right? I will let you look into my mind, and I will let you see what it is that I am about. And when that happens, he basically kind of guides Daken through this whole process. And he says, I was in charge of Hell's laboratories, a place not so different from Project Hellfire. I experimented with potions and alloys and runes and magic. I dissected and spliced together species. I built weapons, abominations. The Hell Hulk was supposed to be my greatest creation. And he says, of course, there's more to the story, much more, but you know just enough to torture you in your grave. You want to protest, I know this. You can't. You can't move. You cannot even breathe. That's because the cane has a paralyzing curse woven into it that it's time for you to sleep, and it's time for the Hell Hulk to awaken. So he quite literally locks Daken away, right, and just goes on the hunt in order to release Hell Hulk seemingly across the world. And that's when you start to get into Hell Hulk's entire origin here. Because what we're told here is the titles of our world do not translate exactly, but Severus' purpose existed somewhere between magician and scientist, that he conducted experiments on behalf of Mephisto, experiments in pain and in power, that his subjects were human, animal, virus, plant, demon, and everything in between, that this was an incubation chamber for demonic seedlings, that the infernal furnace was a site that you could maybe compare to the Hadron Collider beneath Geneva or the Scorpius machine at Los Alamos, a dangerous source of supercharged energy. One of his experiments involved breeding demons who could absorb its force, fueled and weaponized by Hellfire. And we're told it was a success, a terrible success, that you could say that's when Hell Hulk was truly born. But births are vulnerable and life-affirming. Erupted is a better word for such an unnatural disaster. And that's what's nuts about this. And this is what I mean when I say Hell Hulk is the strongest version of Hulk running around out there right now. Because as this origin story continues on, one of the things that we find out is that when Hell Hulk emerged, it went on a rampage all throughout Hell. Throughout the entire realm of Mephisto, it went on a warpath, destroying everything that it could come across, right? Just extreme, mindless rage. And then Hell Hulk found Mephisto, and where Mephisto is at the absolute peak of his power in his own realm, it means nothing. None of Mephisto's barriers, none of his spells, none of his incantations, none of it makes any difference whatsoever. That Hell Hulk literally starts pummeling through every single defensive mechanism that Mephisto has, and even his offensive attacks, right, to the point that Mephisto almost dies. And so what ends up happening in this time period between Bagra-ghul's defeat after the events of Wolverine and Ghost Rider's crossover, when he's basically locked away by Mephisto for his punishment for failure, and the time that he returns and possesses Daken, is that Mephisto calls him back, right? He literally recalls Bagra-ghul. The reason being because Bagra-ghul, despite simply being a demon and less powerful than Mephisto, it has a special ability to figure out the weaknesses of whatever it is it happens to be facing off against. Sometimes these weaknesses are mental, sometimes they're emotional, sometimes they're physical. And so Bagra-ghul had the ability to overcome Hellhulk. And that's exactly what happened. That Bagra-ghul tore Hellhulk to pieces, ripped him into parts, and while it wasn't enough to kill him, it was enough to scatter his remains across the world. And that's why all of its bits and pieces have been everywhere, influencing all these people and screwing up all these people's minds. But looking at this, right? A version of Hulk, despite the fact that it's not Bruce Banner, that's powerful enough to overpower a Hell Lord in their own realm. That is no small feat. It would be like Hulk showing up and pummeling Hela or any one of those guys, right? Like, it's an incredible feat of strength here. And so switching back to Severeth, what ends up going on is when he travels back to Project Hellfire, he takes the head of Hellhulk and reattaches it. And initially, like, Dr. Spivey walks in and is like, what are you doing? Like, why are you reattaching his head? And that's where Severeth is just like, you should probably run, because this thing is activating right now. It's coming back, and when it does, no pun intended, there's going to be hell to pay. Now, the crazy thing about this is that in this confined space that Daken is in, the spell that was cast by Severeth was designed to keep Bagra-ghul locked away, basically keeping Daken from being able to access his Hellverine powers. But that's where he says the failure of Severeth was only accounting for the Hellverine aspect, because anybody who knows anything about Daken in Marvel Comics will tell you it's cool that he's possessed by a demon, but that hardly puts a dent in what he's capable of, because Daken is hardcore. This dude was Dark Wolverine during Dark Reign, for God's sake, right? I mean, it's almost impossible to really kill this guy. And so what ends up happening is he literally cuts himself loose from the staff, which turned into a demonic worm and started to consume him, and then breaks his way out of this prison. And when that happens, he shows up just in time to confront Hellhulk. But by the time he gets there, Hellhulk has basically broken out, right? He's escaped and taken off. Not only that, all these people here in Project Hellfire were killed by this guy, right? They were absolutely obliterated by Hellhulk. I mean, it makes sense. They would never have a chance. Even Dr. Spivey seems to be suffering with mortal wounds. We don't really see her die per se, but we do see Hellverine race off. And this is where things get wild, because at this point, Hellhulk is traveling through the DC metro area. And that's where Daken says the problem is my infernal sense feels like it's going haywire. Evil is everywhere. Pain is everywhere. I'm riding through the wake of Hellhulk's escape. Its rage is contagious. The metro is a war zone. There are too many people to save, so I do what I can, which will never be enough. These are people who are jumping out of buildings to their dooms, crashing into cars, crashing into each other, killing each other. It's absolute pandemonium. It's like 28 Days Later happening in Marvel Comics. But throughout all of this, it's all happening because Severeth has Hellhulk in the back of a rig and just driving him through all this stuff. All the while, he's just irradiating this energy that's driving people to madness. Now, if I'm a betting man, his intention is to drive Hellhulk into hell in order to destroy Mephisto. But we don't know, because we have to wait until next month. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.